Hi everybody, Mike from the Digital Media Program here today to show you guys how to use the pen tool inside of Adobe Illustrator. All right, there's a couple of things that you'll need to get started. You'll need our PDF worksheet that we'll be going through, and you'll also need the exercise file that we're going to be working on top of. You can find both of those inside of Blackboard. All right, let's get started. So there's a couple of kind of a preface before we begin with the pen tool, in that it is a tool that is very basic to Illustrator. It is fundamental to how Illustrator thinks, and that is with vector paths, not so much with pixels as you would probably be familiar with. Illustrator thinks in terms of anchor points and paths that go in between those anchor points. And with the pen tool, and by the way, the pen tool has nothing to do with a literal pen, so get that out of your mind right now. So what you end up doing is you end up literally drawing out these vector paths, anchor point by anchor point. Now that being said, we're going to go over the pen tool in a very detailed way, and actually what ends up happening is the pen tool, while a very fundamental tool and good tool, it's not always the best tool to use for every instance. In fact, if you can create an illustration without the pen tool, and sometimes you end up using a mix of tools for the most part, but as much as you can get away from the pen tool as possible, that ends up usually speeding up your illustrative process because it is kind of a tedious tool to use. That being said, there are times when you can't create an illustration without something like the pen tool, or you can't refine your path, as we'll see in a second what a path is, without using the concepts from the pen tool. Inside of Adobe Illustrator, you create anchor points, and those anchor points, it then draws a vector path in between those anchor points. Unlike a program like Photoshop, it would create those literal pixels in between that line. This simply does more of a geometric calculation. You create two anchor points and it draws a path in between those anchor points. Now, obviously, we need more than just straight lines. We're going to need curves. So what we do is, extending from these anchor points, we have what are called Bezier handles, or also called control handles. Bezier was a notable mathematician. But anyway, sometimes you'll hear me call it Bezier handles or control handles. These control handles, they end up acting very much like magnets to the line. Paths can be open or they can be closed paths. Open, and we'll kind of get into like why that's a significant distinction, but just kind of keep that in mind. And then there are different kinds of anchor points. And this is usually the thing that trips people up quite a bit. There are smooth points, there are corner points, and there are also cusp points. And cusp points are really just another type of corner point. So a corner point is probably what you literally think of as a corner. The shape that you're trying to create, no matter what it is, it stops at a corner and then it comes, in an abrupt direction in any direction, right? A cusp point is really just another type of corner point, but it has these handles that draw out the line to a bit of a point here. You could think of like the tip of a sword would probably look like this. And then you can also have it where it's only a single control handle creating a single curve and then out to a straight line. There's also the smooth point where the line just sort of continuously goes through the path like so. The other concept that I want you guys to consider is that when you're drawing your paths, you tend to want to create a rough draft. In that when you first draw with the pen tool, especially your first run with it, you're not going to create a perfect illustration. But what you're going to end up doing is then using some of your other tools, particularly the A tool, to refine your path. You can also use the anchor tool. And we're going to dig into all of this stuff. This is just a quick overview of what we're going to do. So you can see here this path of the heart, just a basic shape to kind of practice with. It's pretty wonky when I first illustrate it, and then I refine, and then I refine, and I refine again. We're going to dig into some of these other options here as we go through, but just kind of keep in mind that they're here. I need to fix this. Some of these paths are supposed to be lining up to these numbers. Oops. Incidentally, if you're using a Mac, and for some reason I forget to say it, Control and Command are always the same keys inside of Adobe. So if it says Control Y here for this hotkey, it simply means Command Y, and so on and so forth as we go through some of these other hotkeys. The Alt Option key on a Mac is simply the Alt key on PC. Okay, so those are the only two differences between Mac and PC. I will try to give out both each time we present a hotkey. So let's go into Illustrator, and we're going to start with part one, the UH logo. So first things first, I'm working inside of Essentials. You can also work inside of Essentials Classic, so either of these two will work for you today. All right, so make sure that you're on the working layer. You always want to make sure that you're working on top of your, you want to stay, well, first of all, you want to stay organized with your layers. It's a generally good practice to work on top of your tracing layers. In this case, I have a tracing layer set up here. If you remember from exercise 1, we looked over how to create those tracing layers, but I've gone ahead and set that up for you in advance. All right, so I'm going to press the P key to bring up my pen tool. And we can see here, it is this tool right here. Okay, I need to make sure I'm on my working layer. And I'm going to hold down the Alt key, and I'm zooming in with my mouse wheel, by the way. So that's usually a handy way to zoom in and out of your document. So holding down the Alt on Mac, it's Alt Option. You can also, incidentally, and you'll see me do this quite often, is hold down the spacebar key, which will temporarily bring up my hand tool and let me drag around my document. So if you ever need to drag around your document like that. Okay, so whenever you're tracing your layers, don't zoom in like really, really far. You know, this far is completely unnecessary and usually ends up being kind of distracting. You also don't want to be zoomed out way too far, because then it's just very hard to be accurate with a mouse. All right, we're going to start with the basic corner points. So we have the UH logo, and this logo actually has multiple strokes applied to it, in that it has kind of multiple lines on the outside of it. We don't need to trace every single we don't need to trace these two strokes on here. We only need to trace one. And it doesn't really matter which one you pick. You could pick this one right here. You could set that, or you could trace this inner one right here. I'm going to go ahead and trace the inner one like that. And as I trace like this, so I'm going to go ahead, each time I click the mouse a single time, it will create a anchor point, and then it's going to draw that line in between those anchor points. Another thing that you'll note is you'll notice that even though my path is open, right? Remember how we talked about paths can be open or closed? Our path hasn't been closed yet. We haven't completely wrapped it around. You'll notice that the fill is starting to kind of fill in as though it were a closed path, right? It's trying to, even though it can't really figure out where that, I'm going to go ahead and just temporarily change my color to kind of a red so that that's a little bit more visible. See how this it's trying to fill that in, but it really can't. So as I trace around here, you may notice that, oh, well, wait, I can't see where I'm supposed to put my next anchor path. This is the first hotkey, which is Control or Command Y, and that will temporarily hide the stroke and fill of all your paths. This is a view setting, so it's a toggle. So if you simply hit Control or Command Y a second time, it will reveal those options. It's not actually changing the object itself, it's just a view setting. You can also find that view setting under View, let's see, Outline right there, Outline, and that'll obviously change to View Preview when you want to deactivate it. So I'm going to hit Control Y so that that's activated, and it's just going to make my path a little bit easier to do that. All right, and then now let's say I accidentally make an error with my path. And I think, well, obviously with corners, you probably, this shape in particular isn't very difficult to trace, but let's say you do make an error. Now, you might be tempted to go ahead, and the way that you edit individual anchor points, as we kind of covered in maybe a previous lab, is that you grab your A tool, and we call it the A tool because that is the letter on your hotkey. Now, Illustrator is a two-handed program. You want to use both hands here. So I'm going to press the letter A on my keyboard, which will bring up my direct selection tool, and then I'm going to try to click and move that anchor point, and then I'm going to press the P key to bring up my pen tool, and I'll notice that, wait, what has happened here? My path isn't, wait, I'm missing, wait, what happened? Okay, so this is something that you want to avoid doing. I want to press Command Z or Control Z on the PC, and I'm going to undo that a few times. And then I'm going to reactivate my path by simply clicking this anchor point a single time with the pen tool. Now that path has become active again. One of the things you want to avoid doing is you want to go ahead and trace a rough draft path. Now, obviously with this one, your path is going to end up being pretty good, but you're going to want to trace your path like so. So you're going to want to continue tracing your path and then editing it after you've closed the path. So I'm going to close my path I'm going to finish my path and watch your cursor. Your cursor will tell you what's going to happen. In this case, we can see here that as I mouse over the beginning, my first anchor point in my path, that it gives me a little circle icon. That's going to indicate to me that I'm closing off my path. And now, once my path is completed, I can now go in, grab my A tool. I can click these anchor points, and sometimes you need to deselect your path. So a good way of just deselecting everything is to kind of click off of it somewhere. So I'm going to just click off to the side to make sure that everything's deselected. And then I'm going to click that anchor point and drag it down there. And then any other edits I may feel that I need to make, maybe I drag. So another thing that you can select with the direct selection tool is the line itself. So I'm going to select the path, and I'm going to drag the path. And that will move both the path and the two adjoining anchor points like so. Mine is looking pretty good, but feel free to pause the video and make any edits as you see necessary. Now you may notice that I have traced the U and not continued tracing like the literal shape of the H and the U as a single path together. This is actually a good practice. If you have two objects that are behind and in front of one another, it's usually a good idea to go ahead and, even if it's very rough, trace the object that is behind, or continue tracing that object that is behind the thing that is in front of it. You don't need to like trace a lot of details in areas that you know are going to be hidden, obviously, but in order to kind of keep these paths kind of workable, I guess, in a sense, you're going to want to keep them separate. Like in this case, the U and the H, the U is clearly kind of behind the H, so I want to draw it in that manner. So now I'm going to go ahead and draw the H. And I'm just going to go a little bit faster. Now, if you guys would like, you can hold down the Shift key on your keyboard. And what that will do is it will constrain your anchor point to a 45-degree angle from the previous anchor point. So you can see here, I'm holding down the Shift key on my keyboard, and it is constraining my next anchor point to a 45-degree angle like so. All right. And we'll just finish that up right quick. Pretty easy. I think corner points are the ones that everybody gets really quickly. It's obviously just a corner. There's really not much to it. I'll go ahead and hit Control Y, and we can kind of see how we're doing here. Maybe I'll remove my stroke. If you need to refine your path again, use that white arrow tool.